All over the planet, there are weird and bizarre stories of the unexplained and unbelievable. The high, isolated mountains of Bolivia are no exception to these. Back in 1968, a young woman tending to her livestock on her farm was visited by a vicious stranger who went on to slaughter her entire livelihood in one of the most brutal and intense encounters ever to come out of South America. Join me in this episode as we look into the strange story behind the sheep slayer of Potosi. Welcome back to Moonlight Lore, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins. Today we are looking into one of the most bizarre cases of ufology to come out of South America, and considering how many come out of this region of the world, it certainly says something about this case. So going back to 1968, into the mountainous region of Bolivia's southern highlands, we come to the old silver mining city of Potosi. Considered to be one of the highest cities in the world, at an astonishing 13,500 feet above sea level, and yet still sitting at the foot of Cerro Rico, the mountain said to be made of silver. The city and the mountain boasts a rich history of being one of the major suppliers of silver for the Spanish Empire up until the 18th century. Now, of course, the mountain Potosi sits in the shadow of isn't literally made out of silver, but the amount of silver mining and exporting that had come out of Cerro Rico in the past was more than plenty enough to earn it the nickname of the Silver Mountain. But our story doesn't take place on the mountain, but rather just a few kilometers away. It's here we meet the then 24-year-old Valentina Flores, who was out working on her homestead and in the hills tending to her flocks of llamas and sheep, which made up her family's livelihood. At the time, Valentina's husband was away on a job to bring home a little extra cash, so Valentina was working alone, taking care of their secluded farmland and her infant daughter. Now, as one could imagine, shepherding both herds of llamas and flocks of sheep in the rough Bolivian landscape, along with taking care of the small homestead and looking after an infant child all alone, took an incredible talent. Valentina, luckily enough, was one of those women with such talent, meaning there was very few things she couldn't handle or would faze her. That is saying, until that fateful day just after Easter, her understanding of the world around her would be put to the test and force her to question her grasp of reality. After a long day of caring for her infant daughter, working around the homestead and tending to the livestock, evening was finally coming, which meant Valentina made it through another day of keeping her livelihood intact. It was when she began corralling her flock of 64 sheep off of a grassy hill near her home that she realized her day was not quite finished. To her dismay, she realized her herd of llamas had wandered off and away from the sheep and needed to be found and brought home. With what I imagine was a bit of annoyance, Valentina shepherded the 64 sheep and lambs toward the stone corral near her home, made sure they were pleased with sitting still in the grassy area to feed, and headed off up into the hill to try and get a higher view to see if she could spot her llamas. By this point it was around 4 in the afternoon, and Valentina was eager to finish her day of work, to go home, make supper and spend time with her daughter she had been carrying all day on her back in a blanket wrapping known as a manta. As she continued to trek across the rock and grass-covered hills, she managed to find her small herd of llamas grazing in a meadow about 45 minutes away from the field she had left them in, and began leading them back towards the homestead. As she wrangled the stubborn llamas back home, she crossed over the grassy hill which faced her yard, and then looked up to spot something truly strange. Looking down near the stone corral, it looked as if someone had come and placed a gigantic net across the whole top of it, which also had a pointed top as if it was held up by a pole from the inside like a tent would be. Valentina's home was pretty secluded and no one else should have been around to set this up. Even more disturbing, the 64 sheep she had left in the grassy area near the corral were all gone. So why was this thing here? Valentina was definitely confused, and any fear she might have felt in that moment was if her sheep were alright under the net. The llamas probably didn't need much convincing to stay up on the hill to graze a little longer, so Valentina quickly rushed away from them and ran straight down the hill towards her home. By this point, it was probably getting close to around 6 p.m., and the sun was beginning its slow descent behind the horizon, but still allowed plenty of light for Valentina to see everything clearly. She approached the netting above the corral, but was hesitant to move in closer as the strange webbing substance that draped over it was nothing she had ever seen before, but also the fact that sheep can be generally pretty loud when they want to be. But if they were inside, why was there nothing but silence coming from the inside of the tent? Somehow, after a few long seconds of mulling it over, Valentina worked up enough courage and pushed back her fear to finally approach the netted corral and find a conclusion to the mystery before her. With caution, she walked slowly to the netting and peered through the mesh of the net, where her eyes met a horrifying sight. Lifting up part of the net to step inside the covered corral, she entered into a scene she had only seen in her nightmares. Sprawled out at her feet and through the entirety of the stone corral were the disemboweled corpses of her entire flock of sheep. 63 motionless bodies that made up her livelihood were completely gone. As Valentina's eyes stared in disbelief, darting from one lifeless corpse to the next, eventually her eyes were met with an even more confusing sight. The last of her herd, a small lamb, was still alive, just barely breathing, but its neck was in the firm grasp of a short, odd-looking creature. It was small, so small she actually thought it was a child leaning over the bodies, but even if it was, she knew it wasn't human. To her, she had never seen an entity like this before in her life. This small, 3-foot-tall humanoid creature, wearing what looked like a tight diver suit and brown boots, had the last lamb trapped between its kneeling legs with one of its hands firmly on its neck and a cylindrical rod with a razor-sharp hook at one end that was attached to the body by means of a chain in the other hand raised above the lamb. Later, Valentina would go into further descriptions of the little man, saying while he was kneeling down over top of the lamb, he had an open plastic bag next to him on the ground, completely full of sheep organs and entrails. While short, he was also rather portly, with red crisscrossing straps marking an X across its chest, holding up a mechanical rucksack on his back. She was also able to get a clear view of its head and facial features too. Though there had been some different versions of its head, this is what Valentina described. Donned upon its head was a blocky helmet with a propeller on top. The other version is that of a more rounded helmet lacking any propeller and also covering its face. Though luckily, in the original version, Valentina was able to see its facial features. He had an incredibly pale face, as if he had never been in the sun, and had bright blonde hair with blue eyes. What's probably the most bizarre feature the little man had was his large and bushy red mustache covering a good portion of his face. Valentina had never seen someone like this little man before, and as they remained unmoved, making eye contact with the other, both unsure what to do, Valentina snapped out of it, and confusion exploded into absolute rage. Seeing the absolute carnage and decimation of her family's livelihood, she unleashed a flurry of screams and profanities at the now startled man. With fire in her eyes, Valentina began picking up the bloodied rocks lying on the ground amongst the corpses and threw them at her sheep slayer. The man, now getting pelted by rocks and fearing such an angry woman yelling at him and approaching fast, stood to his full height of 3 feet, dropping the last of the lambs. In one swift motion, the little man leaped from his spot by the lamb to a small standing device. Later on, with Valentina's very limited knowledge of technology, she would compare it to the appearance of somewhat like a radio. The man grabbed the sides of the device, one of which had a wheel-shaped lever, and pulled it down, causing the elastic netting covering the corral to quickly retract into the mechanism. When the netting was fully sucked into the device, Valentina, still on her rampage, was met with another figure standing just outside the corral, but on the opposite side from where she had entered. Realizing it had now been seen, the other little man outside the corral abandoned his cohort and took off up a nearby hill and sat down onto a strange-looking chair. Seeing a second one gave Valentina a brief pause, especially when witnessing the second figure sitting on the chair deploy blades that came out of what it was sitting on and took off into the sky. It was then, after watching one escape its crime, she was determined to make sure the little man still in the corral with her wouldn't get away without a fight. She removed a wooden, iron-tipped cudgel from the bag she had draped around her shoulder, a cudgel being similar to that of like a baton or club almost, which she almost likely used to help stubborn sheep and llamas to where she wanted them to go. But now, instead of using it as a tool for work, she fully intended on using it for her violent goal of ending this little man's life. With tunnel vision, she made her way across the bloodied floor full of bodies and angrily raised the cudgel above her head, getting closer to the man. Now, with probably what was with a bit of desperation to save his life, the man tried speaking to a fast-approaching Valentina in a language she couldn't quite comprehend. It was neither Spanish nor Quechua, the indigenous language from many South American countries, and still blinded by hatred and rage from the loss of her sheep, she didn't care what he was trying to say to her. With her cudgel raised above her head, she brought down the club square in the man's face with accurate aim. Blood poured out of the man's nose as he was still screaming in his foreign tongue, and it was at this point he decided to fight back. Still wielding the cylindrical rod with the hook on the end he had been using to rip apart the sheep, he, in retaliation, threw the rod at Valentina, ripping the skin and slicing her chest and upper arm. Valentina remarks afterwards the only reason why the rod hadn't stuck into her chest and possibly killing her was because of the heavy and strong material that made up the knot holding the manta together, which held her daughter still safely on her back. But the fight between the two was far from over. The rod the small man had thrown at her then retracted back to him by use of the chain that connected his body to the rod. Once again he threw the rod, but Valentina was ready for it this time and dodged out of the way. And now seeing an opening for another hit, Valentina swung her cudgel as hard as she could, making contact with the man's outstretched forearm. In a cry of pain, the man let out more words in his unknown tongue, some of which I could only assume were a few choice words, as the cudgel caused his wrist to go limp and become immobile from that point on, with blood now pouring down his arm. This last hard-hitting blow to his arm seemed to be the last straw for the little man. As he tried to recover from the hit, he darted away with amazing speed towards the hill where his partner had flown away from before. Valentina, however, wasn't about to let this man get away in the same manner his friend had, and chased him, still screaming and waving her cudgel around. With tremendous speed and using its still good left arm, the man was able to reach out for the radio contraption it had used to retract the net, and bounded out of the corral, up the hill, and took off into the sky in the same manner his partner had done before, leaving Valentina to look up and watch helplessly as the intruder disappeared into the clouds, never to be seen again. Feeling defeated and longing to extract revenge on the little man who had decimated her livestock, Valentina contemplated on what to do next. Still in shock of what she witnessed and experienced, she sat on the hill for several minutes, trying to collect herself. But with little else she could do in the moment, she returned to the bloodied corral to collect the last of her sheep, hiked back into the hills to collect the remaining llamas, led them to the safety of her home, and settled down for a night of what I'm sure was a lot of restless sleep and keeping watch over her home and the remaining animals. A couple days had passed, and Valentina's husband had returned home, and the pair were both very eager to get some answers. They reached out to the authorities, but to which a large detachment of soldiers from the Bolivian army responded to and marched onto the farmland. The soldiers went right to work, ignoring most of the questions put forth by Valentina and her husband, and collected all 63 sheep carcasses from the corral and loaded them into several military trucks. They then collected multiple samples from the strange man's dried blood that was left on the ground and the cudgel. And without a word, the soldiers left, leaving Valentina, her husband, and infant daughter alone on the farm. A few more days would go on without word, but eventually somebody did return to the farm to discuss what had happened and to ask further questions about the encounter with the little men. It was here the men who talked to Valentina and her husband told them the sheep were missing multiple internal and external organs, including all of their eyes, ears, tongues, body fat, and the fact that nearly all the sheep's blood was completely absent from their bodies. Unfortunately for Valentina and her family, any hope of seeing the bodies of their prized sheep again would be diminished after the military refused to release the corpses. Usually if a sheep were to die on their farm, they could at least harvest the wool and meat to sell, but now with 63 out of the 64 sheep gone forever, the Flores family were forced to sell off the remaining llamas, and farm to move away. Back in 2001, famed Spanish author and UFO investigator J.J. Benitez traveled to Bolivia and managed to finally track down Valentina and her husband to hear their story. What really stood out to Benitez at the time was that after just over 3 decades from the event, Valentina and her husband still had no idea what a UFO or an extraterrestrial even was. Growing up in the very secluded mountains of Bolivia, and both from humble farming beginnings, they both would probably never have had even an opportunity to learn about little men from outer space. When Benitez tried explaining the concept to them, Valentina was reported to be completely dismissive of the idea and showed no interest in the concept. The only thing that seemed to spark any kind of interest out of her was when she was asked and questioned about the little men who had attacked her and her livestock. Even after 3 full decades since the attack, it was obvious Valentina still held strong resentment towards the little men who attacked her. And who could honestly blame her? The encounter left 63 of her sheep senselessly slaughtered, forcing her and her husband to sell the remaining livestock and their farm just to make ends meet, not to mention leaving her wounded from the hooked rod the man had thrown at her. At the time, the Flores family weren't the only ones plagued by little strange men in rural Bolivia either. It would seem there were quite a few farmers out there who had a bone to pick with these intruders. Around the same time Valentina had her run-in, farmers scattered among the isolated hills and mountains had been questioned by the Bolivian government about their own experiences. Some claim to have witnessed 2 individuals matching the description given in Valentina's encounter, stalking around their herds of animals in the hills. Others have said they have seen them actually in their animal pens, then running away before being confronted by angry farmers, only for those farmers to find the intruders had killed a few of their sheep, all of whom also had all of their blood drained and organs taken. It's a very bizarre case, there's no doubt about it, but could this story shared by Valentina and other ranchers in those mountains be true? Could there have in fact been little funny-looking men from outer space harvesting the organs of sheep in Bolivia back in the late 60s? Valentina's story is certainly one of a kind, and there are few that match its weirdness. And stories about aliens coming down from the stars to harvest the organs of farm animals is certainly a common theme, but again, I want to drive home the fact that Valentina and her family would have no knowledge of other alien encounters, or possibly the concept behind them. Now, I'm going to make some assumptions here because I'm not at all knowledgeable or fluent in any indigenous Bolivian beliefs or stories. So for all I know, they could have some folklore or old stories that revolved around the idea of people coming from the blackness of space. Mainly I just want to say this because of the common idea that modern UFOologists have is that ancient aliens have been present and written about in many cultures around the world, but I don't necessarily go along with this idea as much as others might. But say if we do go along with this idea just for a second, maybe Valentina did somehow gain influence and heard stories of extraterrestrials coming down causing trouble. Then, perhaps something else might have caused all this trouble, which got the better of Valentina, and she may have made up the tale of spacemen. Bolivia has its fair share of predators that would love to turn sheep into a snack. Jaguars roam a couple different parts of the country, though typically like to stick in more forested regions of the country rather than the high mountains near Potosi. So one making its way up to the Flores' farm is not really likely. The maned wolf is another predator who could potentially be the culprit, but in all honesty, these wolves are not nearly as big like North American wolves are. They have long, funny-looking legs that give them their height, and get to be around the size of a large breed of domestic dog, but that's about it. They also don't typically like to travel or hunt in groups, making one come to a farm, killing and then eating 63 sheep is very, very unlikely. Then there's the spectacled bear, also known as the Andean bear. It's the last kind of bear in South America, and its habitat does coincide with the high mountain ranges the Flores' farm would have been located. Although they like trees and streams, they have been known to travel and live in the mountains as high as around 15,000 feet. But of course, the spectacled bear is also most likely not our culprit either, as they aren't very aggressive to humans and are much more likely to run away and hide from us. And the fact that they are not like most bears in the sense that they prefer eating plants rather than go out hunting for prey. So one of these making its way to the farm and killing 63 sheep to eat doesn't make any sense. These 3 would seem like they would be the main suspects, but all 3 fall short when looking at them to fit into the story. My main point in bringing these up was the thinking perhaps one of these animals abandoned their habitat and went against their nature to walk up a mountain and into a farmyard and butchering an astonishing number of sheep. Now what I was thinking was perhaps this all went down under Valentina's watch. Perhaps she had left the farm or wasn't paying attention, and to only come back to find her entire livelihood killed off by a simple predatory attack. Then, possibly fearing the shame or anger of her husband, she made up the story of the little man to convince everyone the sheep died in a scenario she would have no blame in. I don't necessarily agree in this theory, or do I think that Valentina was lying, but I just want to try and cover all bases here. For someone more on the skeptical side, like myself, we typically find trusting the words of those involved, with no evidence or proof to back them up, to be a little difficult to accept. Of course, though, by all means, I am open to the idea. Stories about cattle mutilations and human abductions do fall in line with this story as well, making the idea behind this story about aliens coming down, extracting organs and innards from the livestock, a little more believable. There are plenty of people who fully believe in this story, and there are those who have tried to make connections to a well-known race of alien known as Nordic aliens. This particular race is said to be humanoids, resembling Nordic Scandinavians with similar blonde hair, blue eyes, and fair skin the little men on the Flores farm were said to also have. Only problem with this race of alien is they are said to be around 6 or 7 feet tall, double of what the little men on the Flores farm were said to be. Also, they are said to be more peaceful and loving beings, far from how the little men Valentina encountered had been acting. So we are left with a couple choices here. One of which might be something else could have happened back in 1968, which caused the brutal deaths of 63 sheep, like an animal attack or negligence on Valentina's part, or Valentina's story is in fact the truth of what really happened up there on that mountain. Really, there's not much to say either is true or false, and mainly comes down to what one wants to believe. As for myself, I'd like to believe that some aliens had come down and caused all this trouble. It certainly makes for a better story than just some animal coming along killing a bunch of sheep under the watch of someone too embarrassed to tell the truth. I like to typically base my beliefs on the scientific facts and truths that make up our world, but in this case I think I'm willing to give it a chance and say Valentina could very well have been telling the truth. The galaxy is a very big place, more than likely filled with hundreds of species of life traveling around searching or researching other life forms on other planets. Mathematically speaking, it's nearly impossible for there not to be a few other species out there who are just as curious about us and our planet's animals as we would be about them and their planet's animals. So again, like in the last episode, I'll leave it up to you guys to decide if you want to believe this story. Regardless of if it's true or not, we can't deny it's a fun and exciting tale. I for one have found this topic extremely interesting to learn about, and I hope you also felt the same. If you did, and you have a friend or family member who you think might also enjoy hearing this story, feel free to share the podcast with them. It helps the podcast grow and become more visible to others on the podcast lists. Also, if you have a spare minute, please consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. It only takes a minute and really helps the podcast grow. Your constant support means a lot. If you have a story of your own, no matter how big or small, I'd love to hear about it. Or if you have any suggestions for future episodes or simply just want to say hello, feel free to message me by email at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com or by Instagram at moonlightlorepodcast. I'd love to hear from you. But until next time, keep your lanterns lit and keep exploring the unknown.